Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. From our Southern Fire Exchange team, I'm joined today by Laurel Kays from NC State University and Marianelle Armstrong from the University of Florida and Tall Timbers Research Station. I'm excited about our webinar today, and I'm glad you're here. Today we have a presentation by Dr. Jason Gordon from the University of Georgia and Dr. John Willis from the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. John and Jason will be discussing some of their recent work studying public perceptions and acceptance of pine forest restoration efforts in the South. Following the presentation, there will be time for you to submit questions for further discussion. I would like to take just a moment to share a little bit of information about the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast. We're a collaborative among the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, NC State University, and the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. We're sponsored by the federally funded Joint Fire Science Program, and we are the southeastern branch of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network. Working with our network of partners, we develop programs, opportunities, and events that bridge the divide between the fire science and natural resource management communities. We have over 80 of our past fire science and management webinars recorded and posted to our YouTube webinar archive. Fire and natural resource professionals across the country have used these recordings for professional development, RT 130 courses, agency trainings, and online classes. So if you have your smartphone, you can scan that QR code on the screen right now, and that'll take you right to our YouTube webinar archive. Otherwise, we'll have the link in the chat window shortly. And finally, if you're joining us today from an area outside of the southeastern US, please look into connecting with your local Fire Science Exchange network. These are the folks that are working to connect regional managers and researchers to address local fire science issues and make differences on the ground. You can visit firescience.gov for more information. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Jason Gordon is an assistant community forestry at the University of Georgia, Athens. He teaches courses in arboriculture and community forest management and coordinates the internship and practicum courses there. He holds degrees in natural resource management from the University of Georgia and Penn State University. John Willis graduated with a PhD in forestry and evolutionary ecology from Michigan State University. John previously worked as an assistant professor of silviculture and forest ecology at Mississippi State University for 4 years. Currently, John works as a research forester with the United States Forest Service in Auburn, Alabama. So with that, welcome John and Jason. Appreciate having you with us today. And one moment, everybody, as we trade out presentations.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Dave. And the way we're going to do this is kind of a little bit informal, if you will. And John is going to just pipe in, and we're going to kind of tag team when the opportunity arises. This project, which is funded by Joint Fire Science, took place a few years ago now. And so thanks to Dave, we are resuscitating it and trying to remember what we did. This is a fun study, though. I will say that there's been a couple other studies, which I'll mention in a minute, that have come up kind of about the same time. So we're starting to develop a bit of a body of knowledge on this particular topic. So just to kind of start off a little bit with the problem and kind of the context of this. We have quite a bit of research that has documented perceptions among private forest landowners regarding prescribed fire for fuel reduction treatments. There is less known about the attitudes of both the public as well as private landowners towards these risk management prescriptions for ecological restoration specifically. So in the specific context of ecological restoration, people have not tended to ask questions about how the public and how landowners both feel about this, other than some literature that is kind of disconnected with forest management that I'll talk about in a couple slides. You know, as we have people that are listening from all over the country, so for those of you who don't know, longleaf pine was once one of the most ecologically important tree species throughout the southeastern United States, with an estimated original range of around 92 million acres. Even though the preservation and restoration of longleaf pine ecosystem has become a top conservation priority, there's only a little less than 5 million acres of longleaf pine that are remaining, with much of its acreage in poor or kind of a degraded condition. A lot of the loss that occurred was on private land, and was driven by market demand and the economics of growing other pine species like slash and loblolly pine. And over time, longleaf pine restoration has become more of an important policy. I'd say maybe within the last several decades, we've seen throughout the Southeast a real emphasis on kind of restoring this important ecosystem, and particularly among Forest Service, Department of Defense, organizations like Longleaf Alliance and Americans Longleaf, and they put a lot of investment into this and a lot of time, and really have done a lot of good in restoring this particular habitat.
And Jason, just to hop in from a biological standpoint,
Absolutely.
I think really the key with this is a lot of the restoration work that's been done up to this point, as Jason mentioned, has been federally focused. So what we end up having is these islands of restoration out there with a large matrix of unrestored land in between. And the vast majority of that in the Southeast is private. And a key issue here from a biological standpoint is connecting these islands together so you can have movement of species, the genetic influences of having connected landscapes is important. So we don't have isolated populations. And so if we're going to get there, we need to connect these federally managed islands of restoration of longleaf with some pockets of some private land to enable some of this movement of species and genetic, maintaining genetic integrity.
Yeah, connectivity. So the southeastern United States is owned, about 60% of the forests are owned by private forest landowners, non-industrial private forest landowners. So so we have to have this group of owners on board in order to really call restoration of the longleaf habitat a successful, truly successful effort, at least on a landscape scale. We have seen after Hurricane Katrina, there has been some increase in acreage of longleaf, but this is, relatively speaking, limited. And of course, fire is something, when we're talking about longleaf, fire is something that plays a hugely important role in habitat restoration, but there continues to be a lack of implementation of prescribed fire. And as I mentioned earlier, we found out after we concluded this study, Melissa Cray, who I think was also another JFSP project, and I believe, I could be wrong about that, and then Jennifer Fawcett at NC State. Dr. Cray is from Penn State. Jennifer Fawcett's from NC State. I think they both have JFSPs looking into very similar topics on this. So again, we're starting to get some movement on having a better understanding of how people think about the use of fire in the longleaf context, in this context of ecological restoration across a landscape, a large landscape, regional landscape. So there's quite a bit of research on how forest owners think about prescribed fire, but again, there's less on how owners and the general public think about the context of restoration, using fire in the context of restoration. In particular, our project that John and I are talking about was in response to the JFSP task statement, which asked for more research, more knowledge on the social barriers and facilitators to prescribed burning. And so we put that in the specific context of ecological restoration. So that brings us to this other area of research, attitudes towards landscape restoration. And we have a paper, I think Dave's going to put up a link at some point, Canadian Journal of Forestry, which goes into more detail about all this. But we as kind of a guiding framework, more or less, we looked at how attitudes towards landscape restoration, particularly in sort of these micro scale restoration projects, going as far back as the late 90s. And there was a whole lot of movement around the Chicago area, and sort of the Chicago Greenbelt, and the conflict and kind of what people thought about this restoration activities that were going on there. They found generally positive attitudes towards restoration, but opposition and controversy have emerged over these specific practices of restoration, such as using herbicides, such as harvesting trees, such as applying prescribed fire, or reintroducing certain types of wildlife. A lot of these studies have examined social conflict in restoration. They focused on public lands or volunteer efforts. Now, on private lands, there's a lot less research. We have a lot less knowledge about it. Private lands restoration, to understand how people think about it, the researchers have applied some type of contingent valuation or willingness to pay type of approach for non-market goods applied to government cost share programs. Individual background factors have found to be influential in support of restoration, but there's basically, it's a mixed bag. There's a lot of variation on that in terms of gender, age, and residence, and so forth. There's not really a strong trend that we could see there in the literature. Reintroduction of carnivore habitat, for example, has been met by resistance by rural populations, but there's support from urbanites. Proximity to the area is another background factor that has not been a very good indicator unless it has to do with a river, the restoration of a river. Other variables have included income, property size, the region where it's occurring, ownership objectives, education, and direct experience with conservation issues. But again, there's a lot of variation in these results. Urban-rural residency was something that we were particularly interested in, and that's important to consider in the longleaf pine range, because 3/4 of our area here in the Southeast is classified as urban by the census. Some other variables that come into play, and you'll kind of see some of this emerging as we continue to talk about the results. Recreation benefits, there's physical landscape characteristics, aesthetic values, and kind of interference of human utility of the landscape, and kind of environmental values and things of that nature, concern about the state of the ecosystem. Those have all been looked at and cited as key influences in support of restoration activities. Now, one thing that we want to bring up, we think is really important, is that because based on the literature, a lot of this is there's these place-dependent nature of attitudes towards restoration. Place attachment, and that's the kind of the emotional bond between a person and a place, or some other kind of measure of connectivity with the landscape, really should be considered in predicting support for restoration. We've kind of seen this thread come out through these various studies that have looked at acceptance of landscape restoration. The importance of place may help explain why many of these studies concerning the social dimensions of ecological restoration have centered on these micro, or at best mesoscale sites like rivers and parks. So that makes our study kind of interesting or different, because we're going to wrap place into this story, but we're looking at it's a regional analysis, okay, across multiple states of the Southeast.
And Jason, from my perspective, and this is what really attracted me to this project, is I think the term restoration it's a happy word. It's generally an agreeable word that a lot of people can get on board with. But then when we start talking about with longleaf, especially in stands that have been long degraded, they've gone through years of fire suppression, it's going to be a long, difficult, and sometimes ugly road to get back, which involves a lot of treatments that some people may or may not be comfortable with. So understanding these factors like you're talking about, urban, rural, their connection to the landscape, things like that. This is interesting, I think, for all applied land managers, because this is the reality that I think we all exist in if we're going to get these large landscape scale restoration projects going.
Yeah, that's the and that's so. Some of previous authors have written is to the effect of we many of us in terms of efforts towards ecological restoration have great intentions, but we have to consider that it gets complex on the social side of things as well as the biological side, and people have different perspectives. And at first, by and large, people are in favor of restoration, as you just hinted at. But then you start getting into sort of the details of how are you going to create this restoration? How are you going to make this happen? And then sometimes people get less enthusiastic about it. So these are the overall objectives of our study. Describe residents' knowledge about longleaf pine, assess attitudes towards longleaf pine, and identify landowners' interest in prescribed fire for restoration management. You notice in there we took a bit of a different approach in that we were interested in knowing the general public's attitudes as well as landowners. And the reason for that is because our perspective was that not all landowners live on their property, as everyone knows. They might live in a city and their property's several hours away. But people are influenced through social networks of the people that they interact with, neighbors and so forth, who don't own land. And so media and so forth. And so that's why we're interested in just kind of scratching the surface of these public attitudes. Kind of guiding us in this was this model of variables. And so this is, of course, based off of largely based off of literature. It's modified for place-based attributes. And we were interested in this because it's not just applicable to forest biomes, but also wetlands and prairies and other rural and urban landscapes that are being restored. We threw in this quote by William Jordan, who is a very influential ecologist. And you can see here, he wrote this in 1994. It's just an interesting quote, a point that he's making, that ecological restoration is this continuous dialogue rather than just a program. It's a long, ongoing thing with interactions between the social side of the restoration process, as well as the ecological side or the biological side. And I like this, the end of this, that says, it's the dialogue that sustains a democratic society and makes it adaptable to change. And I think this is really important to point out because, in our case at least, because restoration is not going to happen without people being involved, both the experts as well as the lay people. So moving on into the methods, there's several pieces to this research, and I'm kind of lumping them all together for the story today. One of the things we did was to conduct qualitative interviews across these states. You see the map here. So Eastern Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida Panhandle, and Georgia. Sites were selected based on the Southern Forest Future Project, which is based on FIA data of the gain and loss of longleaf, and you see that there in that table. So we wanted to go to counties that were kind of losing longleaf, and then also talk to people within counties that were gaining longleaf at that time. We used, with these qualitative interviews, these were called key informant interviews. So we spoke to people who were knowledgeable about the topic at hand, and from many different kinds of perspectives. Initial KIs, key informants, were identified through local directories and internet sources. They included, for example, landowners, of course, non-industrial private forest landowners, of course, government, natural resource agency folks, consulting foresters. We talked to people representing landowner associations, both at the state and local levels, other land managers, and some other knowledgeable folks that might have came up through what is known as kind of a snowball sampling process, where we ask people, who else can we talk to? Interviews lasted are usually typically around an hour or so. We try and keep it at about an hour. Each interview was interviewed with a semi-structured instrument and explored attitudes towards longleaf pine forest, role of that longleaf forest play and forestry play in fostering degraded landscapes and social and biological constraints. Following each interview, we did do the snowball procedure to get more interviews, and we basically did this until we started seeing too much repetition within the data, and that's known as saturation. And here's the summary of the interview questions. I think the instrument was about 6 to 8 questions long. This is a summary of those questions, open-ended questions to allow for kind of a conversation. And there was 4 of us conducting these interviews, and we were able to make comparisons between the results. The other thing we did was conducted a telephone survey. This was a dual frame cluster area probability sample that included cell phone and landline numbers of residents across 130 southeastern counties within longleaf pine's historic range along the Gulf Coast. This was conducted by a telephone marketing firm in 2017. They did conduct a pilot study prior to the rollout of the full survey, and we subsampled within that frame non-industrial private forest landowners with at least 10 acres. So 821 of this 2,700 respondents were forest landowners with at least 10 acres. The sampling distribution across the region included 7% in Texas. Louisiana had about 21%, Mississippi 18%, Alabama 27%, Georgia about a little less than 9%, and then Florida at a little over 17%. So it was spread over based off of these distribution of longleaf. So what all this means is that we had 2,700 completed surveys in the data that we're going to present to you in a minute. And this is kind of a rundown of the survey questions. What were people's knowledge about longleaf pine? That kind of served as a basis for asking them follow-up questions. If they had no knowledge about longleaf pine, then our survey interviewers, who were employed by the firm, and they're trained in this, they do it all the time, they would give a short explanation of longleaf, and I can show that to you in a minute. Then we addressed attitudes of residents or of the participants towards prescribed fire, their behaviors and attitudes towards forest practices and regulations, resident meanings associated with the local landscape, kind of assessments of well-being, and we brought in this place attachment idea that we talked about. Then we had some questions that were just for landowners. So 11 out of the 19 substantive questions were for the general public, and the rest were for landowners. So for landowners, we asked about their interest in participating in a cooperative forest management arrangement with other landowners. And what we're trying to get at there is some of the stuff that you're seeing with Tree Farm, for example, or some of these efforts that are going on, from what I understand, going on out west, Oklahoma and Texas.
And Jason, could you just remind me, and as Jason mentioned, we're remembering what we did, kind of the idea behind the place connection was longleaf wasn't that based upon kind of our ideas that people just felt different about longleaf than the other southern pines? There's something about it that it connects, it just brings about a different feeling than loblolly or slash pine. And we don't know what that was, but we thought it was important. right? Wasn't that?
Yeah, that's it.
Rationale.
And I have more explanation of that coming up here, but that's essentially it. It's the idea that we kind of wanted to explore beyond. So we also had, you can see here, the last kind of type of question was willingness to participate in a longleaf incentive program, like, cost share program that many of you are familiar with. And that's been looked at a lot in the research. So we were thinking, well, what is there another kind of construct that we could explore that might motivate interest in this? And so we settled on this idea of place attachment. And you'll see the scale in a few slides. You'll see the scale that we used for that, that's been tested thousands of times. But it was this idea that people have this kind of connection with this, it's this important landscape and this important landscape feature, in a similar way that people might be attracted to or have an attachment to southern live oak, maybe, or certain features of maybe your family land or a local park or something like that. And there's a lot of literature on this. So kind of this emotional attachment to place. So going through the results, we'll start off with this, and we're starting off with just some descriptives here. Knowledge of longleaf pine. We asked people, how familiar are you with longleaf pine? And here you can see here on the slide the possible answers. And you'll see later on in the presentation, when we started doing more statistical analysis, we did some combining of these cells, but this was the original type of responses for the survey. I've never heard of it. I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. I know the difference between longleaf and other pines. I have knowledge of the conditions longleaf pine needs to grow. So if you look at the left-hand graph, just under 25% had never heard of longleaf pine, and over 10% had knowledge about the conditions that it needs to grow. I thought this was somewhat surprising. This is not something I really expected. It does go along with our place attachment kind of hypothesis. But a lot more people have heard of it, and then you have a considerable amount of people, really, relatively speaking, that know some details about longleaf pine, and I think that's important to recognize. So we next what we did was we asked them a series of questions, and you see the items there underneath the right-hand graph. Longleaf pine was once a dominant forest ecosystem, have been increasing over time, provide habitat, benefit from fire, and owners are participating in conservation programs. We created a scale or a score out of those items, just a summative scale, very simple. And you can see here that the extent of knowledge for those who were familiar with longleaf pine, with a maximum of 10, or 2 points of grain for each item, and then less on the left side, the 5 is for not agreeing with that item. And so we have a pretty nice curve there, with the majority of people having a fairly decent amount of knowledge about longleaf pine as we were presenting it. Familiar. So then we move into, and this is not necessarily in the order of the survey, but it's logically ordered for the presentation here. What about people's familiarity with prescribed fire? What have they heard of this? And remember, we're talking to people who are in Jackson, Mississippi, or Gulfport, or where, Mobile, as well as forest landowners. How familiar are you with the term prescribed fire? And you see here, quite a few said not at all, but then we also had quite a few that said some or a lot. And I thought this was also, those numbers are percentages. I thought this was somewhat interesting as well. But the majority had none to some familiarity with the term prescribed fire. I'm going to let John jump in here to kind of add some illustration to some of these results.
Sure. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, but for those of you who are not, the link between fire and the longleaf pine ecosystem in the southeast, those two are firmly connected. Without fire, the vast majority of the longleaf pine range would turn into a different forest cover type. And so the understanding, kind of connecting to the previous slide, where we had a fair amount of people who were familiar with prescribed fire, what we were really interested in were, are people making the connection between prescribed fire and longleaf pine and recognizing how important that is. And when I was out there I did some of the surveys in Alabama and Florida, and I tend to agree with the quotes that are on your screen that indicate that folks generally, they are aware, that they have some knowledge of longleaf pine or of the importance of fire in longleaf pine. And to me, that's really important, and it's indicative of all the outreach education that's gone on over the previous decades, that there is been a impact to where members of the general public are becoming aware of this. And I think that was also, those statements were echoed by some of the public land managers, the forestry consultants, people of that type, that thought that the majority of landowners they come across have made this connection. And so this is a really positive thing for the land management, forest management community, is getting this message across that prescribed fire is essential component of managing this forest type. That was the initial barrier in my mind. And so now that it seems as though we've made some progress there, I mean, that's encouraging going forward for longleaf restoration.
Yeah, and this is, we're getting into more detail here, which is what research is supposed to do. We have some previous research that did they may compare regional comparisons among people between survey respondents and wildfire, and prescribed burning. And they have found that the South is more, people in the South do tend to be a little bit more amenable to prescribed burning and kind of have an understanding of fire in the landscape relative to some other places. But here we're getting into more detail, certainly, about the importance of that.
But Jason, just can you go back real quick?
Sure.
What encouraged me too, and I should have mentioned this, is so where I was at was kind of like the cradle, I guess, most prescribed fire professionals consider, the area of the country where there's long been a culture of prescribed burning, and the practice of prescribed burning didn't really stop. Southern Georgia, the panhandle of Florida, southern Alabama, that's kind of the hot spot. But seeing these quotes from Texas and also from Louisiana is very encouraging, that we're getting across to the western part of longleaf's range, which has long been considered kind of the weak spot in the longleaf outreach and longleaf restoration. It's really historically been Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, Alabama. Well, moving west, if this is indicative of how folks are feeling in the western part of the range, that's great news.
So getting into restoration, based on your knowledge of longleaf pine, and you'll see the note I have down there, 24% of respondents were provided some information. Basically, that short description that was provided was, when restored to full ecological function, longleaf pine forests are among the most diverse forest ecosystems in the world. They provide wildlife habitat for different types of wildlife, and they specified that. Research has shown that longleaf pine forests are resistant to certain types of insects, disease, fire, wind, and other risks. All right, so after that was said to those 24% of people, we get this result. Based on your knowledge or new knowledge of longleaf, to what extent are you interested in reestablishment of longleaf pine forests? We used reestablishment instead of restoration because to make it a little bit more conceptually understandable. So, and you see here, the majority of people were at least some or a lot interested in reestablishment. Of those who were not supportive of restoration, more were non-landowners than landowners. This is just comparing frequencies. And of those who supported restoration, more were non-landowners than landowners. So this shows that landowners are more consistent or were more consistent in their views than non-landowners. Those who were supportive of restoration had higher knowledge scores. Going back to, I'm just going to go back real quick to remind you of what that is. That's this graph here on the right. So those who were more supportive of restoration had higher knowledge scores than those who were unsupportive. And I guess that's kind of unsurprising. This is a bit of a summary of several of these means comparisons that we did. Comparing owning landowners having less than 50 acres versus more than 50 acres and urban versus rural residents. And remember that we had something of a hypothesis that residency or urban versus rural would make a difference. So what this graphic is showing is that support for longleaf pine restoration and attitudes about prescribed fire for those supportive of restoration, about 32% were forest landowners, and little over 7% of those landowners owning over 50 acres supported restoration. Urban respondents tended to be more supportive than rural respondents, but this was not significant in terms of the statistics, the distribution between these two types of people, of respondents. Rural residents tended to see more of the benefits of prescribed fire more favorably than their urban counterparts, and owners with more than 50 acres saw prescribed fire more favorably, although again, that was not significant. Owners with more than 50 acres saw prescribed fire, however, regarding knowledge of longleaf pine, rural residents had higher scores than urban residents, and respondents with more than 50 acres scored higher than their counterparts in terms of knowledge about longleaf pine. So we did have some differences there among these different types of people, thinking that ownership or the amount of ownership in forest land and urban versus rural residency might make a difference. John, I'll leave you with this slide.
Okay, so again, kind of connecting the knowledge that people had about restoration. And I said at the top, restoration is a happy word. And I think that was reflected a lot, that a lot of people were in favor of restoring longleaf pine. And it seemed to me that, and this is just my impressions, that a lot of the folks that were in favor of it were some of the older landowners that I talked to, some people who had fond memories of the property that they grew up on and things like that. But I think in general, most people were pretty favorable towards this in the general public. I will say that the one thing that stands out to me was from a forestry consultant who, while he was favorable towards the broader movement of longleaf pine restoration, this gentleman was a little bit hesitant because he felt as though there were people being pushed into longleaf restoration due to a lot of the cost share programs and things like that. And that kind of went against his ethic as a land manager, because in some situations that was pushing landowners into just situations that weren't going to be conducive for longleaf pine restoration. And he wasn't in favor of that. But I would say on the whole, as you can read from these quotes on your screen, the general public was generally in favor, and most land managers, practitioners were also favorable of the overall restoration movement.
I'm going to start kind of go fast. We're already running out of time here. Attitude towards prescribed fire. You'll see that this is a list of items that we had to ask about what they thought about prescribed fire, starting off with a negative indicator. It endangers wildlife or human life. And then the following three are kind of positive kind of benefits of prescribed fire. And you'll see that there was a recognition of that there's risks involved as well as benefits. And This chart on the left shows an agreement score with those 4 prescribed fire items. And you can see that overall there tended to be a favorable view towards prescribed fire. On the right, you see those who were supportive of restoration tended to have higher prescribed fire scores than those who were unsupportive. John, I'm going to go ahead and skip through this slide here.
Sure.
Finally, as far as the frequencies go, we had a question on there that asked about landscape aesthetic preferences. And you can see how the items looked here. And overall, an open landscape, what we described as an open landscape with scattered trees and native grasses and forbs growing on the ground, received the most amount of responses. This is really not, this kind of maintained landscape is really pretty consistent with the literature regarding preferred landscapes and natural resource management. Really across the country, this is the kind of response that you would tend to see. So I'm going to go in quickly to some kind of a prediction exercise that we did. And in this, we went through most of the variables in the preceding slides. Our dependent variable in this predictor was, do you support longleaf pine restoration, or do you not support longleaf pine restoration? And the key variables, and this is in line with our model, was the knowledge of longleaf pine, our prescribed fire indicators, and we separated those out into the one item that was disagree versus the 3 items that agreed, that kind of the benefits of longleaf pine. Or, I'm sorry, disagree and agree. And then we have another item, another variable that was the benefits of fire. And then we have our place attachment scale. We already talked a decent amount about close attachment. This is the scale we used. It's based off of Williams and Vasky. This has been tested a number of times. It has a very high reliability score in terms of how well these measures reflect people's responses. Just to remind you of the model that we used. And this is how it turned out. So we tested a progression of models by introducing sets of variables and then observing how those models changed and comparing the models. But for the sake of time, I'm only talking about the final model here. The final model introduced attitudes towards prescribed fire. Of the 2 fire predictors that we had, prescribed fire benefits score and the prescribed fire endangers variable, only prescribed fire benefits added significantly to the model. So the endangers part, sort of the negative perspective part, fell out of the final model. So increasing support for restoration was associated with increasing positive attitudes about the benefits of prescribed fire. And this model also showed that support for restoration was likely to increase with increasing knowledge. If you can see my cursor there. So increasing knowledge would tend to lead to support for restoration. Increasing feelings of attachment to place would lead to support for restoration. Forest ownership, unlike what we thought, forest ownership in any way we measured, whether forest acres or the number of longleaf pine acres, was not significant. So forest ownership did not seem to play into this as at least as important as these other ones. Age was important. Now, now you do this kind of research, you do the qualitative methods in order to inform your construction of the survey, but also to get new ideas that you haven't thought of and that kind of thing. So John mentioned he remembered several of the older people really being more emotional about longleaf restoration. What this is showing here is actually there is more support for longleaf restoration as age decreased, which is kind of interesting. Race, Caucasians were more likely to support longleaf, and then higher educations were more likely to support, and then females were more likely to support longleaf restoration. So just a few discussion slides here. Again, most informants valued, most of our respondents in total valued longleaf pine and its restoration. That's consistent with some previous studies. Much of the interest in restoration has been a result of increasing interest in ecological values. KIs also noted that the products derived from longleaf pine can be more valuable in some cases than other southern pines, depending on their site context. Knowledge and previous experience with fire was important for accepting fire as a management tool, and the favorability towards fire was associated with support for longleaf pine restoration. Really, for us, one of the most impressive and kind of anticipated findings, but is what we thought was very interesting, was the strong correlations of place attachment and positive attitudes towards prescribed fire for supportive restoration. So that was very interesting, having that place attachment. So that needs to be looked at in future analyses as well. Let's see. We also saw in this survey, in the survey with preferences, there's kind of a traditional longleaf pine habitat that is maintained by regular small intensity fires, and that's that park-like aesthetic that people pointed to. So that was sort of aesthetics is certainly an important part of this, and the expectation of what fire and longleaf restoration should be looking like. There's this cultural affiliation with longleaf pine, including its affiliations with or its interactions with fire, and that influenced support for restoration. That we think was strongly tied to this idea of place attachment. Much like when you think about the Gulf Coast, you think about southern live oak, or some of these other features that we talked about. Again, what was less expected was the finding that there's rural and urban residents did not have an influence. Urbanites were not more interested or less interested, significantly, statistically speaking, than non-urbanites. And then other sociodemographic factors, unlike what a lot of the literature says, came out as important. Age was important, race, education, and gender were all important in that final model. I'm going to go ahead and move through this. One more slide. This is the final slide. Implementation of fire was noted both in our key informants as well as the survey as challenging, and we're aware of this. Despite the increasing interest in the restoration of longleaf pine, it's still challenging to apply fire. Liability was a leading factor for landowners' decisions to use prescribed fire. Another major issue was smoke issues. Our key informants said landowners would become discouraged because of air quality guidelines, which they found difficult to follow, fitting it into the weather window and so forth. Cost and liability coverage were cited as major constraints. But despite these ongoing concerns, cost share programs were cited as being very important in motivating landowners to manage their land. And increasing knowledge, as I said, is also very important. So you put these two together, increasing knowledge and cost share programs. These are both efforts by government agencies as well as nonprofits. And with that, combined with the fact that the general public in our survey is all in favor of longleaf restoration using burning, I think it's a real opportunity for us to continue on this positive path that we've been on in terms of the efforts of restoration, but also probably expand on those efforts, both financially as well as in terms of educational efforts and expansion of programs, including cost share programs. And so because of time, I'm going to stop there. John, do you have any last minute points?
Nope, you covered it in the summary.
Okay, Dave, I think we can open it up to questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Gordon and Dr. Willis. Appreciate your presentations today. Once again, if y'all joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange Program with the University of Florida. And joining us today was Dr. John Willis from the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station and Dr. Jason Gordon from the University of Georgia. At this point in our program, we'd like to provide an opportunity for you to ask questions of our speakers. Because of the number of folks we have on the line today, we will be taking questions through the Q&A tool in Zoom. So if you have questions or comments that you'd like to share with our speakers, please type them into Q&A, and we will get through them in the time we have remaining. I see that we already have one question from Peter, and Peter asks, what did you use to determine whether or not there was a net loss or gain of longleaf within a given county?
That was I mentioned that in the slide. That was the what's it called, John? The forest futures analysis. It's FIA data.
We had a comment that came in from George, and George says there are prescribed burn associations in the Southeast and across the country, for that matter. It says groups of landowners that get the certification needed to implement prescribed burns, and the members often help each other burn on their properties. So if y'all are familiar with prescribed burn associations, PBAs, do you see how the results of your research might help PBAs in some of their messaging?
It's funny George asked that, because I touched on it at the beginning, but that was in some of our discussion that I had to skip over because of time. But so we did have a series of questions that asked about collaboration. And, I think, John, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure how much interest there was in collaboration among our interviews. I can't remember that for sure, but in our survey, they indicated a fairly decent interest in collaboration with other landowners. So I think that's positive. And I know these PBAs have been growing over time, and yeah, so there's a real opportunity there.
That was my general impression too, that there was overall an interest in collaborating, and that's would really help solve the lack of licensed burn boss problems, burning capacity that we have. That would help alleviate that problem.
And there does seem to be quite a bit of interest in PBAs. A lot of it seems to have come from spread from the Midwest, where there was a lot of success early on, and it seems like we're seeing more examples of successful PBAs across the coastal plain. We have 2 webinars and a fact sheet that our program put together that you can find on our YouTube page and on our website that talk about models of successful prescribed burn associations. And we recently had a panel conversation with folks who are actively involved in PBAs and some of the things that they have learned along the way in keeping those PBAs active and growing. We have a couple of questions. Here's one that just came in from Vernon, asking for some, he has a specific question referring to a piece of property of montane longleaf that he's interested in restoration. Do either of you have resources that Vernon could turn to get information on mountain longleaf restoration to help him move forward?
Well, Vernon, I can tell you that of all the longleaf communities, we know the least about the montane longleaf, and it's been the most understudied. In particular, some of the understory management, those issues that you're interested in. Off the top of my head, Joan Walker's work from she was a Southern Research Station employee who worked out of Clemson for years. She would be a resource who would probably know more than I. The Longleaf Alliance may have, they will have some information on longleaf understory, but in terms of specifically for the montane, to my knowledge, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to poke around. If I find something, I can follow back up and get you an answer.
I know, I guess it was last year at, I think it was either the North Georgia Prescribed Fire Council meeting or the Georgia Prescribed Fire Council meeting. There was a presentation by, I believe it was Martin Cipollini at Berry College.
Yep.
On their efforts. I guess the campus has a pretty significant tract of longleaf, of mountain longleaf there that he's been actively involved with restoring.
He would be a good resource.
So very good. All right, well, I have some questions I'm going to ask you guys, and then if anyone else has questions, they're starting to come in. You know, it looked like from your results, the acceptance of prescribed fire was lowest in the urban areas. Maybe not significantly, but it did look like that was the case. And so based on those results, do you think prescribed fire communication efforts should focus on those areas?
I'll start off with
geographically?
that.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that our study was showing that's important, is that while prescribed fire by itself was lowest in urban areas, if you put it in the context of ecological restoration, you start to see more support. And so I think I think a lot of it is communication and how we frame the context. Maybe sometimes we're not asking the right questions, and it's how we frame these questions that will make a difference in people's response. So short answer to your question is focus outreach in these urban areas, or at least have some outreach in these urban areas, that you don't just talk about prescribed fire per se by itself, but within this context that this is good and a good environmental management activity, or or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And you see that. I mean, you're starting to see a little bit more of prescribed burning in metro areas for kind of these urban landscape restoration. I mean, Chicago's been doing that now for decades, but there's other places as well. So I think I think it's important to think about it within a certain context.
And I think so. To me, it's a little complicated. I think the educational part is important and can certainly benefit, especially absentee landowners who don't live on the property they own, an hour out of the city or something like that. But the logistic problem remains of the smoke. If that is a huge constraint that we have, these two things are kind of coming in conflict in my mind, is the education part, but then the barrier of smoke is still there, and it's going to be larger as you're closer to an urban area. So this is a real issue going forward.
That makes it more of a challenge. Yeah.
I like that point that you made, Jason, about thinking about the message, not just about prescribed fire, but maybe tying it into a practice or something that has greater acceptance. And so I feel like one of the take-home messages from this work and what you're saying is reflected in that, is that prescribed fire messaging may not be best when it's just about prescribed fire, but it'd be maybe more effective at talking about prescribed fire when it's using longleaf or some other context kind of as the story or as the hook.
Yeah, and that's consistent with some previous research. Paul Gobster, for example, Forest Service, who found that overall people, it's primarily in urban areas that they've looked at, but people are supportive of this thing called restoration. But then you start separating out specific management activities, and people start getting more concerned about those activities. But so we need to be able to kind of show the big picture as well as the coarse picture as well as the fine picture at both times.
All right. Well, with that, we are at the top of our hour. It looks like if we had one more question then from Thomas. Thomas, I have put the contact email for both of our speakers on the screen. If you would like to reach out to them directly, please do so. So with that, Jason and John, thank you so much for your presentation today. I enjoyed it, and the really good discussion that we had afterwards. Wish we had more time. And thanks to everybody who joined us online, and we hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.